So tell me a little bit, how did your interest started? Because I've seen this lecture you presented in Stanford, Stanford, a couple of years ago already, that you were talking about the politics of algorithms. Tell us a bit about that first.
Of course. So I became interested in algorithms in part because I'm an ethnographer, which means that I usually spend a lot of time with people and organizations, right? So I go to organizations and I study how people work, I study how they're organized, and I try to understand how people understand the world on their own terms. And so the question of algorithms kind of struck me as an ethnographer because I felt that there was a very critical, well, first there was a very positive discourse about algorithms, right? Algorithms are going to save us. They're much more objective, much more rational, much better than we are. And then there was a dystopian discourse about algorithms where it's the opposite. Algorithms are biased, they're encroaching on our privacy, they're awful, and we have kind of metaphors of Terminator or Minority Report, right? That algorithms are going to make increasingly make decisions for us in ways that are unaccountable, opaque, and discriminatory. And I wanted to approach this question as an ethnographer, asking, what do algorithms look like on the ground? What do they look like in practice when people actually use them in their daily lives and in their daily work? And that's what I decided to study in the book, which is called Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms. And that's exactly what I did. So I chose journalism because it's a field that has been disrupted by digital technologies. As newspapers moved online and as journalism moved online, the business models of most news organizations have really been radically transformed, with print advertising revenues really collapsing and online advertising becoming much more important. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I wonder how journalists and newsrooms deal with that transformation, right? And so I started spending time in newsrooms. So I emailed editors-in-chief and journalists, and I asked to meet with them. And after meeting with them, usually I was like, oh, would it be possible to spend some time in your newsroom? I really want to get a sense of how people are using digital technologies to create information. And so I ended up spending a bit more than 2 years doing hundreds of hours of field work in web newsrooms. And what struck me there was the ubiquitous presence of a specific kind of algorithm, which are called analytics software programs. So analytics software programs are basically these softwares that provide detailed information about what online users are doing at any given point on the website. So basically it gives you information about traffic, right, and about the audience, but very detailed and real-time information, including the number of clicks, the number of unique visitors, the time that people stay on any given article, how they found the article, whether they found it through social media or through Google or through the homepage of the website, how far down they scroll on the web page, all of this information with kind of very fine-grained data about what users are doing. And what I found was that in many newsrooms, journalists and editors were kind of obsessed with these analytics programs, right? They kept fixating and paying close attention to how much visitors were on the website on any given moment, how traffic were evolving over time, whether articles were popular, whether they were going viral, all of these questions. And so that became kind of the central points that I analyzed in the book, trying to understand how journalists in the US and France made sense of these specific kinds of algorithms.
So what were the main differences you found between the newsrooms in the US and France? Because I think that's an approach you take in your book. You were, in the beginning, you were thinking that the French wouldn't be caring too much about the metrics. It turned out to be the opposite, your research has shown. Tell us what were the differences you found there?
Yeah, so you know, as always with research projects, it is a kind of part of that things you're expecting, and then things you're finding that turn out to be different than from what you expected. So for me, comparing the U.S. and France, I came in with reading the literature on journalism in the two countries, and I was like, oh, so okay, so journalism in the U.S. is much more market driven, right? It's a much bigger industry. It's much more driven by financial kind of considerations. Advertising is much more powerful compared to other countries. It's also an older industry because journalism really started in the 19th century, early 19th century, whereas in France it was more of a later development. And so, and the French case, of course, like presented at first sight opposite characteristics, like much less market driven, a strong presence of the state, public subsidies, a kind of more civic definition of the journalist role as public intellectuals, etc. But when I started spending time in newsrooms on the two sides of the Atlantic, I realized that in fact, what I had been expecting, which was that I was like, oh, French journalists probably are going to be more critical of traffic numbers, right? They're going to be kind of criticizing it as a manifestation of market pressure, and that's kind of what you would expect of the French, right? And in fact, it's not exactly what I found. And so basically, one of the main difference that I'm trying to tease out in the book is how, depending on the journalistic traditions, but also on the relationships that journalists have with their public, clicks and analytics software program are going to be taking a very different set of meanings. So for American journalists, really what matters the most, even today, to a large extent, is the opinion of their peers, the opinion of other journalists, of important sources, of other professionals. That's really kind of what's driving their definition of what counts as good journalism. And so when American journalists look at traffic numbers, they say like, yeah, that's like an economic consideration, but it's not really my job as a journalist to focus on these audience metrics. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to write good articles, and these good articles will be read by other people who care about good journalism. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Whereas in France, that's where things got a bit kind of paradoxical. On the one hand, journalists were very critical of traffic numbers. They were saying like, oh, this is another manifestation of the commercialization and marketization of information. This is really problematic, comparing it often to prostitution. So that was an interesting kind of gendered repertoire, comparing the chase for clicks to selling oneself, selling one's body. So kind of metaphors of authenticity and kind of sex work, which was just really interesting. But at the same time, and that's where things got like a bit paradoxical, I found that they paid much closer attention to traffic number, and that they kept talking about how popular their articles had been compared to American journalists. And the way in which I make sense of this is that starting in the late 19th century, and in particular the Dreyfus affair, which was this big scandal, this big judiciary scandal in France, in which suddenly journalists, academics, intellectuals, etc., kind of came together as public intellectuals, trying to guide public opinion and to interact with public opinion as people who kind of are able to kind of think with concepts and ideas. That in fact journalists in France still see themselves as being a bit like this, right? They see themselves as guiding public opinion, as having a relevance in the public sphere. And so for them, many of them, traffic numbers are important because it means that they're relevant in the public sphere. It means that they've reached an audience, they've reached the public, and as such, they are doing a good job as journalists in charge of interacting with the public opinion. So all of this basically made me kind of think a bit about what do we see when we look at traffic numbers, and more generally, what do we see when we look at algorithms? And basically, with this comparison between American and French journalists, I argue that we see different things depending on where we come from, right? So depending on our professional traditions, on our national settings, on what we come to the screen with, on the resources and constraints that we approach the algorithms with, we're gonna perceive them differently. We're not gonna see the same things. So for American journalists, clicks and analytic software programs are about market forces and audience pressures. Whereas for French journalists, clicks are about public engagement and the public sphere. Not only, they're also about market forces, but they also have this civic component. And so that in turn kind of led me to a broader discussion in the book about how do we approach algorithms at a time when they're going to play an increasingly important role in how we interact with each other and how we get access to information.
Indeed, very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Angèle Christin, Assistant Professor at the Department of Communication at Stanford University, and also now during the semester of 2020, Major Social Change Chair at the Institut d'études avancées de Paris at Sorbonne University. Thank you so much, Angèle. Looking forward to reading more and hearing more of this conversation. A pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.